Hello, everybody, and welcome to Creation Myths. As always, if there's any problems with the sound or the video, please let me know in the chat. I'm keeping an eye on the chat, so please let me know if the sound is okay, if there's any problems. If there's an issue, I'll fix it before we, really get going. So here we are. Tonight, I have something that I think will be both fun and infuriating. Because tonight what we are going to do is review the book Replacing Darwin Made Simple by Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. This book was kindly gifted to me by a friend, Mr. Wilford in the chat. This is his fault, so thanks for this. And I read this the other day. I went through it over the course of a day. It's short. It's only 90 pages long, and not all of those 90 pages have, text. So it's a short read. It's quick and easy. And I went through it and I highlighted, and I was basically in a group chat that I have with a number of friends. I was indignantly live tweeting this book, basically. And so what we're going to do tonight is I'm just going to go through and I will offer my thoughts. This is my review of Replacing Darwin Made Simple by Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. And this is going to be pretty unfiltered. I'll start with just kind of basic overview, big picture stuff, and then I'm actually going to go through it because as you can see here, it's not that long, and I highlighted a lot as I was reading. So there are specific things I'm going to want to just pluck out and show you because there are some moments in this book that make you wonder. Because well, let's just get into it. Let's just go for it. A little bit of background here on Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. He has a PhD from Harvard in cell biology and developmental biology, or cell and developmental biology. So he's legit. He knows the field that he's an expert in. He's a legit biologist. He's done research. He's published real papers on his field. He knows about stuff in biology, just in general. He's not, a layman coming in and just spouting off, okay? So he published a book in 2017, I think it was 2017, called Replacing Darwin. And the idea was for this book to make a big splash and be like, here's the actual new theory of how species arise. And the idea is that he makes a case, sort of, in Replacing Darwin, that the species get off the ark. So again, he's a young Earth creationist, just literal 6,000 years. That's it. So 4,000 some odd years ago, you have the ark. The ark pairs get off the ark, and then the subsequent 2,000 to 4,000 years are filled with extremely rapid speciation from those ark pairs into all the extant species that exist today. And we're talking specifically about land vertebrates, right? That's what we care about when we talk about speciation after the ark. So he wrote this book, Replacing Darwin, and what happened? Basically nothing. It didn't make any sort of impact at all. Scientists, to the extent they read it and rejected it because it's terrible. It makes really bad arguments and ignores a whole bunch of research, and the math in it is really bad and overly simplistic. It's bad in obvious ways that a graduate student in evolutionary biology would be able to recognize why it's bad. Among creationists, the book also received relatively little attention, and to the extent the goal was to convince other creationists that this is the way we should explain things like speciation, it completely failed in that as well. So now we have Replacing Darwin Made Simple, which is a follow-up. I think it was published in 2020 initially. I think it was 2020. Somewhat out of necessity or desire to actually get the book attention it deserves, the original book Replacing Darwin, the attention it deserves. And I think also a little bit to broaden the audience by making it less technical and more readable. Now, there are consequences to making it less technical that I'll talk about in just a minute, but I think that was kind of the big idea here. So let me give you just a very brief overview of kind of my impressions of this book and what I thought of it and kind of the structure of it. And then we're gonna go through page by page, and I swear we're not just gonna read 90 pages. I'm just gonna pluck out some highlights just to get into Dr. Jeanson's head and see kind of how he structures the arguments and where in some places it is hilariously, egregiously bad. So that's what we're gonna do tonight. You're gonna see as we scroll, I have just a ton of highlighting. we're not going to stop at everything I've highlighted. I'm going to go through and I'm going to pluck out what I want to talk about. And again, this is off the cuff. This is pretty unfiltered. So like, don't expect this to be super tight, right? This is not a creation myths video, like a creation myth. This is going to be just, I read this book. Here are my thoughts. Man, this is really bad. And here's some of the worst parts. So, so let's put a pin in that little intro bit. And now let's just talk broadly about this book. Just big picture. What's the deal with this book? Like I said, it's shorter, it's simpler, it's less technical than the original Replacing Darwin. But he makes basically the same claims. That means that this book is just full of assertions. The problem is, because it's less technical, he makes basically no effort to back up a large fraction of them. So you get assertion that's just stated as though it is the consensus among scientists, among creationists, whatever. It's just like assertion. And then we move on. But those assertions are mostly wrong. They're not the consensus for anybody. And I'll show you some examples of that as we go through. The attitude in this book is also really interesting. It's almost indignant. And in a couple of places, it's like actually indignant. Like he's annoyed that the original book had such a lack of impact. And he's like, this, momentous, groundbreaking, whatever. Right, he describes his own work in very, very, very superfluous tones, and I don't think that's warranted. It's not, the original Replacing Darwin was not good, and it was not like it. He didn't make a strong case. He didn't do a good job. So this book does not do a better job. But he's in this book annoyed, seemingly and openly, a couple of times that the earlier book did not make a bigger splash. He divides his book into a couple parts. The first part is kind of the argument that he makes. And then at the end, kind of last, maybe quarter, maybe third, it's not the last half, but part of the back part of the book is responding to critics. So he actually tries to respond to evolutionists who have criticized his work. He does this in a completely superficial way, as we'll see as we go through. At one point, he tries to basically steelman evolution and then egregiously strawmans it. It's really bad and does not strike me as serious. So let's do it. That's the introduction. That's what I think broadly of this. It's frankly, it's laughably bad. And for the people there are a couple people here watching that were virtually with me as I was kind of texting back and forth as I was reading this book and taking screenshots and angrily sharing at them. Angrily sharing the screenshots at how bad some of this stuff is. So let's go through and talk about Replacing Darwin Made Simple by Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. So it's chapters. They're short. They're short chapters. It makes for a very quick read because it doesn't bog down on any one topic. The chapters are short. It's easy to get through. There's a lot of buzzwords in here, I'll point out. So if you're familiar with Jeanson's work specifically, or just like evolution and creationism in general, you're going to see a lot of familiar buzzwords. And if you're really into this, if you're if you're a completionist, then you're going to notice a lot of phrases that jump out at you. Like, for example, the gold standard right here. If you know, that's a thing in this debate. So he starts off talking about just basically the evolution creationism stuff, and he doesn't really do a good job presenting it. But I do want to point out, presenting the history of it. It's fine, whatever. But I want to point this out right here. He points out what he thinks is a contradiction, that if creationism has been scientifically tested and rejected, then it must be scientific. So some people will say creationism has been demonstrated to be false. Yes, that's true. Other people will say it's not science. And he says, well, if it's not science, then it can't be tested and rejected. There are specific claims that are made by creationism, like specific hypotheses that are testable and you can evaluate them, and they can be shown to be false. Things like if a structure or if a system has irreducible complexity, it cannot evolve. Genetic entropy. These are hypotheses. They can be tested, they can be shown, and have been shown to be false. Other aspects of creationism, you're just assuming things. You're just assuming a divine being for no reason. You're assuming that the Bible, you're starting from a position that the Bible is literally true. That's several organizations are just upfront about that. That's not a testable position. You can't just test that. You end up, you just assumptions on assumptions. You end up with like last Thursdayism. So there are aspects of young Earth creationism that are not testable and therefore not scientific. They're beyond scientific investigation. There are other aspects of creationism that generate testable hypotheses. To the extent that those hypotheses have been tested, they have been shown to be false. There's not a contradiction here. And I think Jeanson should know that. If he doesn't, he should. Let's see here. So I've also discovered the traditional scientific fields in this debate, the fossils. So he's talking about kind of how people have this conversation, evolution and creationism. And he's saying the fossil record, anatomy, embryology, they take a backseat to genetics. True. In the modern way of doing this, genetics is king. It's all about genetics. This fact is one of the best kept secrets in the 150-year-old debate. No, it's not. No, it's not a secret. Nobody keeps it a secret that the best evidence for evolution and the grounds on which this debate should be fought, nobody keeps it a secret that genetics is the best evidence, and the field of genetics is the ground where the contention is. People ask me, Dan, what's the best evidence for evolution? The answer is genetics. And I can name a bunch of specific things in the realm of genetics. Like, that's what it's all about. Nobody's keeping it a secret. It's just not true. There's a lot of claims like this in this book where he just says something and it's just not true, as we'll see. So let's see what he has here. I love this one. This is where he's like, I'm important. So he's done his own original genetics research, made several groundbreaking discoveries on the origin of species. Where has this work been published? It hasn't been, because he writes for Answers in Genesis, so you find it in their blog, Answers Research Journal, or in books like Replacing Darwin, but you don't find it in the actual peer-reviewed scientific literature because Dr. Jeanson's making no effort to put it there. So he may be making all these discoveries. He's not, because I've read all his work, and he's not making these discoveries. But if he was, the scientific community would be in the dark because he's not publishing for the scientific community. One discovery is relates to the existence of genetic clocks. Molecular clocks are a thing that Jeanson did not discover. Now, he doesn't say he discovered them. He said it relates to the existence of molecular clocks. I don't think his discovery is real. It's not. It's his young Earth dating stuff that I've talked about before. In 2017, his monumental book, Replacing Darwin. Heavy science content, intense genetic it's none of those things. It wasn't monumental. It didn't have heavy scientific content, and it didn't have intense genetic detail. I teach a 200 level undergraduate intro to evolution course. My students could, if they were to read this book, undergraduates in evolutionary biology could point out significant conceptual errors in Replacing Darwin. The math he does is overly simplistic, would not fly. It's just not true. In addition, some of the scientific predictions have already come to pass. He hasn't tested any of his predictions, so I don't think that's true either. He likes to claim that there was a species of finch that was discovered, a new species of finch that validates one of his predictions. The mechanism of speciation in that case was hybridization. And Jeanson doesn't propose his constant rate of speciation due to hybridization. It's due to a different mechanism that was not the thing that happened there. So I don't think that's a confirmed prediction. I actually have, I'll link it down below when I'm done. I have a video testing Dr. Jeanson's predictions, specifically with mitochondrial mutations in the human mitochondrial DNA. I've tested his predictions. I've said, okay, based on his rate and a known divergence time, we should see X number of differences, and here's what we actually see. And his prediction was wildly off. So no, his predictions are wrong. Let's keep going. Okay, so he starts talking about his theory. It's called his theory, it's generous, is called the new origin of species. That's a line from, original Replacing Darwin. So he starts with kind of an interesting idea here. Sorry. He starts with an interesting idea here that if two individuals can hybridize, that would suggest they're the same kind. Hybridization is a really interesting standard for kind because that would imply an extremely wide definition of kind, in some cases way wider than creationists would use. It would also imply an extremely narrow definition of kind in other contexts. So like, for example, all of the non-human apes would have to be separate kinds if hybridization is our standard. So it's not a great standard, which he says, because If they can't hybridize, then, well, that doesn't really matter, which, okay, then it's not a good standard, right? It's not a good standard. Many species many species have been tested. That's true. Haven't been tested. That's true. But he says family is a good approximation. That makes no sense. You need speciation. That's way too fast. That's a bad argument. If family level differences are the the standard for what is a created kind, then like taking the cats, for example, you need 30 something extant cat species. You need I think it's over 150 extinct cat species since the Ark. And you don't have 4,000 years since the Ark to get all those species. You don't even have 2,000 years since the Ark to get all of them. You have until approximately Middle Kingdom Egypt. Some people even argue Old Kingdom Egypt, which gets you to, maybe if we're being generous, 500 years after the Ark. So you need like speciation every couple of years in order to get the diversity you need. And that's not just a problem for cats. It's a problem for different types of birds. It's a problem for various, livestock, like the wild, the ancestral forms. It's a big problem because we have evidence from Middle Kingdom Egypt of lots of diversity in cats and waterfowl and raptors and lots of other things. So that's a silly argument. It's also inconsistent. It's also inconsistent because it would lump things together that creation, like humans and chimps, would have to be lumped together if you use family. But Jeanson just kind of ignore that. All right. So aquatic kinds could survive in the water during a flood. This is silly. This is silly because the flood, one, would have been really hot. Two, would have been really gross water that would have been run out of oxygen at some point. It would have been all really gross and churned up stuff. Also, it's all going to be, because it's a big giant flood violently mixing the surface, you have aquatic and you have marine organisms. We have to draw a distinction there. It's probably going to kill everything, but it's definitely going to kill the aquatic things, the freshwater things. They're not going to be able to survive in the flood. Now, could the marine things survive? Well, it's going to be a marine environment, but it's also going to be a very harsh marine environment. Like the temperature is going to be really, really, really hot. So probably whales are going to not survive either. But this is just a silly argument that all the water things could be kept alive during the violent flood that covered the entire world. Okay, that's silly. So he does go through an argument and talks about how, how many do you actually need on the Ark? And you only need the vertebrates. He goes through all this stuff, right? So the other thing he says here that's really interesting that I think is kind of silly is that if you could have from one family to another, from one kind to another, then you wouldn't need to have all the different kinds on the Ark. Because, say, for example, if members of the elephant family could change it to the frog family, why bring both? Why not just bring one of them and then it could diversify a lot? Now that requires a significant misunderstanding of how speciation works, right? This is the idea that extant things that exist right now, can or could evolve into other extant things that exist right now. If a member of the elephant family a mammal could evolve into one of the frog families, amphibians, then why would you need both on the Ark? Why not just bring elephants or frogs? And then when they subsequently diversified, you would get the other things. The problem here is he's, in addition to just the silliness of the current things evolving into each other, he's conflating could evolve into with would evolve into. And evolution is a process that is guided by the environment as it exists. So you need to have an organism that's not just has the potential to evolve into a specific thing, a specific set of phenotypes, but it also needs to be in an environment that would promote that process, right? So under what circumstances would a mammal, for example, an elephant, evolve into an amphibian? It's a fun kind of just, just think about it. It's a fun thing to ponder, but it's not really relevant for how evolution actually works, because it's just a silly idea of one current thing in one large group of organisms evolving into a different current thing in a different large group of organisms. It's silly. Right, so they're saying same thing here. Since whales and dolphins are aquatic, they could survive the flood. If Say class Mammalia. If that constitutes the kind, then the whales and dolphins could have evolved into all of the other mammals, so you wouldn't have to bring any of the cats or dogs or whatever else onto the ark. Like, this is not a serious argument that somebody is making. This is not an argument that can be made by a serious person. Okay. So, yeah, kind is family, fine, whatever. They say about 1,700 ark pairs. Okay, fine. I don't care. I'm sure that jives with the AIG thing. There's that big poster. If you go to the Ark Park, that has like what all the kinds were. I'm sure it's 1,700. Fine, whatever. I don't care what the number is. Okay. So when did the animals exit the ark? This gets a little theological. So like, I'm not going to worry about it too much because I don't really care. But this is the important thing. About 4,500 years ago. Great. Now remember, that takes you to about 2,500 BCE. Middle Kingdom Egypt, we have just a few hundred years later from that, more recently, that is to say. So you don't have 4,500 years to do speciation. You've got like a few hundred. And also there's an ice age in there. That's why this is relevant, this 4,500 years. Okay, what happened to the animals? They diversified. Okay, so a lot of extinction. That's weird, but it's true. And it also creates a problem for creationists because you have a lot of the fossil record that's laid down post-flood, and they don't have a good explanation for that. There's no flood boundary that is consistent. It just doesn't work. There's problems whether you use kind of an earlier one like the KPG boundary or you use a much more recent boundary. There's no good answer there. Okay, this is a nice short chapter. Okay, so from a scientific perspective, the extinction is not comprehensive. 70% died, 30% survived. Okay, great. Once the skeptic discovered the shallowness, okay, I don't care about the theology. Real creatures, okay, fine. I don't care. Set up the scientific argument. So let's talk about the actual science of what happened post-flood. An ice age, singular ice age. There are a lot of ice ages. I don't know how many. If any geologists are watching in the chat, tell me how many ice ages there are/were. It's not one. It's more than one. So Jeanson does a nice little smoke and mirrors with this in the original Replacing Darwin. He says, look, we all agree. We all agree that there was an ice age. We just disagree on how many and when. But we all agree on ice ages. We all know that there was an ice age. But just how many, how long ago, that quibbles. We all agree on ice ages. He does that in the original Replacing Darwin. So let's see. Darwin's evidence. Okay, he talks about migration of species, but I don't care. Now, Jeanson, this is really interesting. He talks, this is where he gets into linear speciation rates, and he says, like, there's a lot of different ways you could have speciation. You could have, like, very fast, and then it slows down, very slow, and then it rapidly accelerates. You could have kind of a stepwise pattern. You could have a linear rate. He says that you could look at lots of different families, and you get linear speciation rates. And here's, like, an example, and that's, like, it's not exactly linear, but he did a linear regression on it, plotted out the line. It's fine. There's some he shows that are not linear at all. In the original Replacing Darwin, he shows a bunch of these graphs, and there's a lot that are super duper not linear, and it's really funny. All right, the rapid origin of these species at first might suggest speciation happen in quick bursts rather than a constant rate. Okay, fine. Species-rich families, like some rodent families, can form once a decade or faster. Hence, in the few hundred years between the flood and Abraham, and by the way, that's the few hundred years I alluded to earlier, because Abraham is generally regarded as Middle Kingdom Egypt. So if you take Abraham as literal historic, then you basically have until that to get your speciation. So you only have a few hundred years. So a few hundred years between flood and Abraham, abundance of species, and still be consistent with a constant rate. So here he talks about the felids, right? They could split, big cats, small cats, and then within each, you could split subsequently. It's fully consistent. Scripture is fully consistent. He doesn't show any data for any of this. This is where he just like asserts like, oh, it's fully consistent. Math? No math, no numbers. I'm going to show you a graph. We're just fully consistent. Just going to go with it. Okay, what are the implications? Yeah, we might see new species form in our lifetime. For those who are accustomed to thinking in evolutionary terms, this fact will come as a no, it's not. If you're familiar with evolution, you know that speciation can take place quickly. We know that evolution can take place fast. We've observed evolution events in human timeframes, a lot of them. Some of them extremely rapidly. In some cases, you can have speciation due to just one or a few mutations. You can have hybridization events. Happens all the time in plants where you have two different species, they hybridize, and then those hybrids can interbreed with each other, but they can't interbreed with either parent species. Happens all the time. And since we've been able to investigate plant genetics in a systematic way, we found that a lot of groups of plants that we thought were one species, turns out it's lots of species with a lot of hybridization between them. So you get lots of not just species boundaries in terms of morphology, but in terms of fundamental things like ploidy and chromosome number, because when you hybridize, you often end up doing something called allopolyploidy, where it essentially doubles the chromosome number. So now that's plants. Animals also hybridize, like the Galapagos finches I mentioned earlier. Other animals, you can have very small numbers of mutations that result in speciation events. In other cases, we're witnessing speciation events in progress. There's birds called European blackcaps that have two subpopulations that are speciating. There's the apple maggot flies that have subpopulations that are diverging from each other. So these are examples of organisms that we can observe the process of speciation. It's well documented. The fact that it can happen within a human lifetime is not a surprise to anybody. I don't know why Jeanson's painting it that way. That's silly. It really is just silly. And by the way, we're 30 pages in. Like I said, it's not a long book. We're a third done with this. Just trying to make this short. We'll see how long it takes. But there's not a lot of substance here, everybody. So we're gonna keep going. Today, among the 37 species, only one of them will likely form a new species. The next 36 will not. It's just So what he's getting at here is a genetic argument, but he's ignoring the underlying ecological constraints here, right? So he goes into this argument about how it's heterozygosity, and then they become more homozygous over time. So they have lots of differences between the mom's set and the dad's set of their chromosomes in their genome. It's when you have differences, that's heterozygous. And over time, he says, you lose the heterozygosity. You become homozygous, where both copies of a gene are the same. That's not the constraint on speciation. The constraint on speciation is having ecological niches that could support an additional species. So to the extent you have a large carnivorous cat that lives in a particular habitat, you're not going to have a new large carnivorous cat evolve to occupy that habitat. That ecological niche, a large carnivorous cat, right, that already exists in that particular thing. Like somebody is already occupying that ecological niche, so somebody else wouldn't speciate into it because there's competition there. And there's a concept called the competition dispersal trade-off, where dispersing is bad, competition is bad. So if you're dispersing into a new niche that has high competition, you're not going to do that. That's bad. That's going to be selected against. This is like basic community ecology. Okay, this is not difficult. Jeanson ignores all this. He just says linear speciation rates independent of these other constraints. His own graphs from the original replacing Darwin show that it's fits and starts. Sometimes it's slow and then it speeds up. Sometimes it's like a staircase. Sometimes it's fast and then it slows down. And the difference between those different patterns is the ecology in which those different groups of species are living and what resources and what ecological niches are available. Jeanson just ignores all that. It doesn't exist to him. Okay, did Darwin argue that species originated recently? Now, this is one of my favorite tricks. According to Darwin, I don't care. I don't care. Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859. This book was published in 2020. The original replacing Darwin was 2017. I don't care what Darwinian evolution says. I care about evolutionary theory in the 21st century. That's what matters. So I don't care what Darwin says. It just doesn't matter. It's irrelevant, right? So we've got pretty pictures. Yay. This is some really interesting stuff, though, because he does a really funny little bait and switch here. And I want to walk you through it. It's one of the main pieces of evidence that Darwin uses in Origin of Species is domestication. Okay, so he says you can look, speciation can occur because we humans understand the process of breeding, right? We can have this type of horse, that type of horse, this other type of horse, right? And we know how that works. That's artificial selection. We're getting the traits we want. You get different varieties. Well, that happens in nature too. It's just we don't select. It's whatever works best in the environment, right? It's natural selection. It's not artificial selection. It's natural. What Jeanson says, and he does a really interesting bait and switch here. What he says is, look, there's actually more variation in your breeds, right, in your varieties within a species than there is in the species within a family, right? There's more variation within the breeds than there are between the species. Now, he's talking specifically here about morphological variation, phenotypic variation. He's saying, look, here's your typical, equids, right? All your horses, this is what they look like. But within the horses, look at all this variation. This is a wider range of phenotypic variation than what you see in the equids as a whole, right? So let's follow this argument, because he does a bait and switch here that is infuriating. And as a reader, it should make you mad that he thinks this little of his audience. So if you take Darwin's argument that, we could do breeding and artificial selection, you can argue both for the formation of new species and against the change of one kind into another. It should be immediately obvious that all the horse breeds can never bridge the gap of horse-like creatures and their supposed evolutionary cousins. That's not obvious, because we're talking about two different things. In order to do large-scale changes through evolution, we're talking about genetic variation and genetic processes. He's looking at morphological, phenotypic variation. He's talking about two different things. He's making an apples and oranges comparison here and hoping the audience doesn't notice. You take it one step further. Darwin's breed species comparison demonstrates that species must have arisen recently. You all are going to lose it at this argument. I'm so excited to tell you about this. And I forget what I wrote here, but my annotations as we go through get progressively more irritated. So let's just read this paragraph. So comparing variety in breeds and species, evolutionists are forced to concede the recent origin of the latter. It's not going to be true. As we observe, breeds have more variety than species, right? So he's talking about morphological phenotypic variation, right? So about stuff you can see variation. Breeds sometimes have more variation than between species. Yet evolutionists would say that all breed variety appeared within the last 12,000 years or so. Yeah, since the agricultural revolution when we started domesticating animals. Yeah, that's true, right? At the same time, the small amount of variety took millions of years to form. This logic is not consistent. Those are two different processes. Those are two different sets of processes. One is artificial selection, right? Selective breeding. The other is evolutionary processes, a set of natural processes. So what did I write here? Bait and switch. Was talking about genetics, now morphology. Yeah. So he's talking about two different things. He's talking about genetic variation within a kind that can split. He's talking about morphological variation in breeds. He's saying because evolutionists accept that all breeds came into being, then we must also accept that all species came into being in that same time frame or less. That's insane. We don't have to accept that. It's perfectly consistent because it's two different sets of processes. Right? So now he tries to well, what would they say? In response to this claim, evolutionists don't actually drink. Evolutionists would drink responsibly if you're playing the game. Evolutionists would likely invoke data from other scientific fields to argue for millions of years. No, we don't have to do that. We don't have to do that. The genetic data are sufficient. You don't have to do that. Instead of helping their contentions, it would expose the secret evolution kept hidden. No, there's no secret. There's nothing we've kept hidden since 1859. We don't have to go to other fields for long periods of time. Genetics is perfectly sufficient to do that for us. Jeanson, of course, rejects that, but he does the math wrong in a way that, my undergraduate students could explain why he's wrong. So this is just a straw man. Just straight up, that's a straw man. That's not true. The end. This argument up here, breeds came into existence recently. They have more phenotypic variation than between species within the same families. Therefore, all those species must have come into existence recently. That argument is insultingly bad. It's two different sets of processes. Selective breeding and evolution. Two different things, right? Different sets of processes, different rates of change, different constraints. They're different things. Let's continue. We're already up to chapter 8. We're making such fast progress. So chapter 8, let's see. This is confirmation of Darwin's argument for Genesis. Let's see. Okay, so he starts each chapter, by the way, with a little review, which is nice. It's nice to keep you oriented if you're reading the book in chunks. If you're binging it like I did, you could skip over that part. Okay. This is a funny one. In 1953, Watson and Crick and colleagues discovered the structure of DNA. Scientists finally settled on DNA as the molecule possessing the heritable genetic information. That's not true. It wasn't Watson and Crick that demonstrated, and I'll use the word prove, that convinced everyone that DNA was actually the genetic molecule. It's actually my favorite experiment of all time. It's the Hershey and Chase experiment. It's the one where they did they made bacteriophages that were radioactive. One set of phages had radioactive sulfur, which is found in proteins but not DNA. The other was radioactive phosphorus, which is in DNA but not proteins. Then they had their different groups of phages infect their host cells, and they documented post-infection where the radioactivity was. For the ones that have radioactive phosphorus, it was within the host cells, demonstrating that the DNA got inside. For the ones with the radioactive sulfur, it stayed outside the host cells, indicating that the proteins never actually got into the cell the virus was infecting, proving conclusively, finally, that DNA is the medium for inheritance. It's the genetic molecule. So that was Hershey and Chase that did that. That was not Watson and Crick. And that experiment was 1952, if I recall correctly. It was the culmination of a long series of experiments. There was the Griffith experiment in 1929, and then in the 40s, there was the Avery, McCarty, and McLeod series of experiments that essentially should have put the question to bed, but didn't. And then Hershey and Chase finally did in the 50s. Any student of science that's writing about like any genetics-related topic should know that. They should know that it was Hershey and Chase, not Watson and Crick, that figured out that DNA, that demonstrated that DNA was the molecule of inheritance. So that's just a fun little point that I wanted to poke at because that's just sloppy. All right, let's continue. All right, let's see. Oh, so we're talking about mitochondrial DNA, and this is an interesting note. So a little background here. Jeanson does some really bad math to show that the mitochondrial DNA in all humans, if you do something called coalescence analysis, you work backwards to a most recent common ancestor. He tries to show that it converges about 6,000 years ago at Eve, right? Literal Eve is mitochondrial Eve. Now, he says something interesting here. It says it encodes some of the most important and basic information for our bodies to function. Without mitochondrial DNA, we would be unable to convert the food we eat into energy usable for our cells. So we need mitochondrial DNA. It has some really important stuff. Now, here's the thing. When he does his math, he takes a 1 generation rate of mutations. He looks at parents and offspring. He actually takes someone else's data, but whatever. So he takes someone else's data where they looked at parents and offspring and the differences in their mitochondrial DNA. And he says, okay, that number of differences, that's the 1 generation rate. So given all the variation we see in modern humans, let's divide by that 1 generation rate and see how far in the past, assuming 20 years per generation, give or take, how far in the past we need to generate all that variation. And he gets 6,000 years, give or take. Now, the problem with that is something that he points out right here. Mitochondrial DNA is really important. Most of it, if you mutate it, it's going to break something you need, and those mutations will not persist because natural selection will weed them out. So those mutations that occur, that you would maybe catch in a 1 generation rate, in 5 generations or 10 generations or 100 generations, those mutations are going to be lost due to natural selection. In addition to that, the effective population size of mitochondrial DNA is much smaller than the rest of our DNA. That's a fancy way of saying, basically, without going into the nuts and bolts, that there's less variety there. It's just a smaller population in the mitochondrial DNA compared to your nuclear DNA, the DNA in your 46 chromosomes and all your cells, right? And the reason for this is that it's maternally inherited. So you get it from your mom. I'm never going to pass on my mitochondrial DNA, right? I'm a mitochondrial DNA deadhead. So the effective population size, the size of the mitochondrial DNA population that's going to be inherited is effectively 1/2 of the human population. So I didn't do the math on that. That claim is not going to stand up if you do math because I don't actually know the effective population size of human mitochondrial DNA. So don't quote me on what I just said. That's wrong. You have to do math to figure that out, and I didn't do the math. Anyway, it's a smaller effective population size. This means that a process called genetic drift is also going to play a role. Genetic drift is when you just randomly lose diversity from a population. It's just random. So for example, somebody could have a bunch of kids, but they're all males, right? They don't pass on their mitochondria. Well, whatever unique mutations have accumulated in that lineage, those are now gone from the population. So for those reasons, natural selection, because it's important, so like there can be harmful mutations that'll be weeded out, and then genetic drift, just chance events. stuff doesn't persist. The one generation rate cannot be extrapolated back infinitely to get your most recent common ancestor. You need more. You have an apparent slowdown in the rate over time because of these forces like natural selection and genetic drift. The end result of this is that your actual date for your mitochondrial most recent common ancestor is in the far distant past, like 100 to 200,000 years, not 6,000 years. Jeanson ignores all that. I just want to point out here that saying that mitochondrial DNA is really important and encodes some really critical stuff is equivalent to saying that natural selection operates on it, which is equivalent to saying that the one generation rate can't be extrapolated back. So this line right here refutes Jeanson's work on the mitochondrial most recent common ancestor. Okay, if species have been existing for millions of years, large number of mitochondrial DNA, you should have more mutations. No, you shouldn't. So these are figures from Jeanson's papers. They're blog posts at AIG, but he calls them papers. Now, so these numbers are wrong. I've talked about this at length. I can link the videos. I'm not going to go through the math in more detail than I already have right here. So I'm not going to worry about it, but these numbers are ridiculous. The predicted by evolution number, that's wrong because it takes that per generation rate and just makes it a lot of generations. Meanwhile, he's taking the per generation rate and turns out to be fewer generations when you know it. But what you actually have to do is that rate slows as you go back further in time. We're not going to go further into it now. Okay. So now he kind of wraps it up. He says breed species comparison and mitochondrial DNA. It's all recent. Like these arguments are bad. These arguments are dumb. Here's where we get a fun one. He starts talking about radiometric dating, and this is really bad. This is really bad because he's making another one of those you have to be consistent arguments, ignoring that fields are different and processes are different. So he says evolutionists have to assume, buzzword, drink, evolutionists have to assume constant rate of change to do things like radiometric dating. Now, we don't have to assume that. We have direct evidence that the rates of radiometric decay are consistent over time, going back at least 2 billion years because of something called the Oklo natural nuclear reactors. I'm not going to go into it now, but you can Google that. Eventually, I'll do a video on it. It's super cool. But we know that they're consistent. We don't have to assume that. So now Jeanson says, okay, we have to, ice cores, we have to assume a constant rate. Erosion rates have to be assumed to be constant. No, they don't. I know enough geology to know that nobody thinks erosion rates are constant. Like erosion rates vary over periods of time. We know that because environments change. You have erosion, you have deposition, you have different environments are going to have different rates of erosion. You can have weathering by wind, you can have erosion by water. Erosion rates are not constant, and no one says they are. Geologists correct me on that, but I'm like 99% sure about that. Yet in the field of genetic, constant rates end up being, no, they don't. They don't support a recent origin. They just don't. Because when he says constant rates, he means doing the math wrong. What you need to do is it's constant rates of mutations. The rate at which mutations occur is approximately constant, but the rate at which they accumulate, right, is variable with time. In other words, mutations are more likely to be present if they are recent. If, as time goes by, they are more likely to get lost from a population. So you have an apparent slowdown in the rate, right? That's what we mean. The mutation rate, constant. Usually constant-ish. The accumulation rate, right, slows down because of evolutionary processes, right? So this is not a consistent argument at all. Now, this is bad. So for several reasons, invoking changing rates will not work. In light of evolution's historic rebuttals, changing rates would be hypocritical. No, that's just not true. That's just not true. It's not hypocritical because they're different processes. Radiometric decay and erosion and mutation, they are all different processes. They operate on different principles. They have different constraints. There's different things that affect them. So it's perfectly consistent to say this thing is constant all the time. This other thing is constant in this window, and then it's variable, and it's at a different level in this other window. And then this other thing is not constant. It varies over this curve. Those are all completely consistent statements. Those are not contradictory at all. Jeanson pretends they're contradictory. I cannot believe an adult human with a PhD is making this argument. Does everyone see how bad this is? This is an adult with a PhD in biology from Harvard University making this argument. What am I supposed to do with this? There's no reason to take this seriously. Okay, so I left myself another note here, and I don't remember what it is. Let's find out. I think I don't know if I started swearing this early in my notes, but let's find out. There are no actual arguments here, no evidence, just assertions. That is true. That is a fact. Also, Swifter, thank you. I appreciate that. That's very generous of you. Thank you. Okay, let's keep going. We're up to chapter 9, getting enough bodies. This chapter, I don't care about. It's about population rates and like population growth rates. Like, I don't care. It's fine. Yes, things can grow fast. What he ignores is that you're going to have, there's a concept called the minimum viable population, where if you get below a certain level, you have inbreeding, genetic drift, and you end up with lots of homozygosity, and you have lots of harmful traits, recessive traits that are expressed because you're homozygous for those traits, and then the population goes extinct. It's a process called an extinction vortex, and it happens in small populations that are below what's called a minimum viable population size. Now, the populations getting off the ark, they're below the minimum viable population size. So you could do all the math about like, well, they reproduce at this rate, and then generation time is this, and blah, blah, blah. They could grow whatever fast. Yeah, they could. But that starting population off the ark is below the MVP, so they're going to go extinct. Like, Jeanson just ignores that. That's like basic population genetics, conservation ecology. We're just gonna ignore that. Fine. Okay, one more thing we're ignoring. All right, chapter 10. Oh, I love this chapter. I love this chapter. I'm just gonna skip right to it, everybody. If you've seen my recent video on Dr. Jeanson, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson thinks you're stupid. He uses the embryo and cat evolution figure. He uses the development and evolution figure. He says the argument here is that, well, you can get all this diversity from a zygote to a frog. That's a lot more phenotypic change in just 3 years than from your ancestral cat to all your existing cats, and of course all your extinct ones. He also says it's less than 4,500 years, but it really has to be about 500 years. But put that aside, this is ridiculous because this is development. Development is based on just the whatever genetic information you have in the zygote. It doesn't involve generating novel traits. It's just a zygote growing to adult within one generation. It happens to individuals within one lifetime. Evolution involves generating new traits. It happens to populations over many generations. These are two separate processes. And I'll remind you again that Dr. Jeanson has a PhD in cell and developmental biology from Harvard University. He knows the difference. He knows the difference. He just thinks his audience won't care. But he knows the difference here. This is ridiculous. He articulates this argument here, right? This progression from a single cell represents more visible change in the process of forming a new species. Thus, the skeptical claim, blah, blah, blah. Evolution and development are two separate processes. You can't say a frog zygote growing into an adult frog changes more than the ancestral cats to the extant cats. Therefore, the cat evolution could happen in the 500 years between the Ark and Middle Kingdom Egypt. You can't say that argument. That's really bad. And again, I'm astonished that an adult is making this argument. Development proceeds according to epigenetic. This is bananas. This trait, this man has a PhD. Okay, this is where I lost it reading this book, I think, because this man has a PhD. God, I've been going for almost an hour, and we're just going to power through, everybody. It's going to be long and ranty because read this line, everybody. Read this line. The development proceeds according to the epigenetic information in the cell, but speciation is a primarily genetic phenomenon. So he's saying development is epigenetic, which has to do with heritable changes to levels of gene expression that are not encoded in the sequence of the DNA. But speciation is a genetic phenomenon, has to do with the encoded, the sequence, right? That we know that the sequence plays a role in development. I shouldn't have to say this. You can do things like reorder the Hox genes in fruit flies, and Hox genes are developmental regulatory genes, which I'm sure Jeanson is familiar with. And if you take the Hox gene from the middle of Hox genes exist in clusters on the chromosome. Okay. So like the front ones, they say grow antenna. The next set of Hox genes, when they're expressed together, they grow the little pincer mouthpieces. The next set down for the thorax, they say grow the limbs. So the 3 segments in the thorax grow the legs that a fly walks on, right? Well, you could shuffle around the order of the Hox genes, and if you take the ones from the middle, that regulate the development of the limbs, the legs, and you put them at the front end of the cluster of Hox genes, just reorder them, legs grow out of the fruit fly's head instead of antenna. You can Google pictures of that. It's not epigenetic. It's the sequence of the genes. You're switching the locations. The gene that's here, you take that sequence and you put it in a different place, and it has a different effect. Like the sequence map, I can't believe I have to say this, but this is astonishing that he would say this. Anyway, let's keep going. Okay, in a similar way, the mitochondrial nuclear DNA measure time, different starting. I don't care about this. Oh, so now he's getting into the concept right here of created heterozygosity. He's saying we can get enough diversity through created heterozygosity because, well, Adam had his copies, Eve had her copies. Everyone's got 2 of each chromosome. They all have lots of differences, so you can shuffle them up and get lots of new combinations of sequences, and that's how you get all the diversity you see today. It's wrong. It's wrong. It's not how it works. That's not how you get it, and we can do math on this, and I have done math on this. I can link the video down below. I've done a creation myth on created heterozygosity. We actually just ran some numbers on some some of the genes that have a lot of variation, like the ABO blood group gene has a lot of variance. You can just do the math on like how big is that gene, what fraction of its chromosome is it? It's like 1 out of 5,000. It's 1/5000th of the chromosome, and you know, how fast does recombination occur? How long would it take to get all the variants of that gene starting from 4 ancestral copies? You can do the math on that, and it doesn't work for this. People have done the math on that. Yeah, it doesn't work. I'm not going to go into the math now. It's not worth it, but it's just, I'll link the video. It's Jeanson's wrong, and he's wrong in a way that is obvious if you just take like 2 minutes to Google like average human recombination rate and then do some multiplication. He's just wrong. Okay, so they're saying you're not going to lose much variety in 1,000 some odd years. I don't care. Here we go. Now he's saying junk DNA doesn't exist. It's wrong. This junk DNA exists, everybody. Okay, so he's going to cite here. He doesn't actually cite it, I don't think, but what he's referencing is the ENCODE project, saying how 80% of the human genome exhibits some biochemical activity. It's not function, it's activity, and a lot of that is spurious for very obvious reasons like spurious transcription or protein binding. The actual functional fraction of the human genome is generously somewhere between 10 and 20%. So what he says right here, junk DNA is he eventually argues that junk DNA is not a thing. He's wrong. Other creationists argue that 100% of the genome will ultimately be found to be functional. That's ludicrous. That's just not the case. Oh, we have a super chat, and that's very generous. Thank you. Here, let me just put this up because this has a question. Star Runner for $10. Thank you, sir, or ma'am, or thank you. I don't want to gender you. Wasn't Eve a clone, so should have had the exact same as Adam? Yeah, right. So it was like the rib thing. So in theory, Eve would be a clone of Adam. We're just saying she was created. It was a miracle. So just she was created different and just going from there. That's what creationists say. If it's going to be from a rib, then in theory it should be a clone. But like they just say it's a miracle and it's different. That's all. Let's continue. Oh, I do want to just say this. With a few more years of experiments, the function will likely increase. That's not true. It's not true. It's actually gotten smaller. So 2012, the ENCODE project said it was 80% biochemical activity. 2014, the paper that creationists always ignore actually significantly revised the functional part of that downwards. So yeah, it's not going to get bigger. All right. So again, I love this where he's just like, we've seen that 2 independent lines of evidence support me. It's like, no, we haven't. You're just asserting. You're not. This is not good. We're going to keep going because I want to go, I don't want this to take too long. Okay, previous chapter. This is just the summary. Great. Let's see. So this chapter is natural selection. Oh my god. So Jeanson argues that Jeanson argues that the answer is no. He argues the answer is no. So let's find out how, because man, let's do it. Okay, this is his argument, and I'm gonna just go to the end of this chapter real fast. You see, he talks to like genetic stuff, right? We haven't discussed survival of the fittest. We haven't discussed natural selection, right? So this is long. He really gets into it here. So we're going to take a minute on this chapter. But the thing is, he describes a mechanism. He doesn't provide evidence for the mechanism, which you would think he could do just by like demonstrating that his mechanism is responsible or at least correlated with observed speciation events or hypothetical speciation events. You just look at species and see, right? So what he's saying is for new traits to arise from this created heterozygosity, so you have your highly diverse genetic state initially. For new traits, all you need is to lose diversity. You need to go from heterozygous to homozygous. You need to lose allelic diversity, and that's how you get your new traits, okay? So he then extends this to species, and he goes through some genetic stuff, Mendel, fine, like whatever, who cares? Hence, when two heterozygous parents are crossed, changes in visible traits can appear in a single generation. It's true. It's true. You have two heterozygous parents. Some of their offspring are going to be homozygous for a recessive trait. They're going to look different. That's not speciation, though. That's just like variation within a population. That's all that is. So for new species to form, in technical terms, homozygosity must be maintained. So he's saying you have your ancestral species has this heterozygosity, lots of variation. And then those differences, as those lineages diverge and branch off from each other within your family, within your created kind, each individual lineage becomes more homozygous, right? Becomes more homozygous. So you have all this variation, and it kind of gets apportioned into each lineage. And whatever variance each lineage gets, that's responsible for making each lineage its own thing with its own unique traits. That's the argument here for how speciation works. He hasn't discussed survival of the fittest. He's not talking about natural selection. He's talking about a completely different mechanism for speciation. So you start with enormous genetic variety, and then you have reproduction and migration. You lose variation in your different lineages. They become new species. That's it. That's what he says is the process. No. In order for that to work, think about how this would have to work. Let's just think about how this would have to work. I'm going to come back to this stuff, but think about how this mechanism would have to work. You have 8 variants of a gene, right? You've got a highly heterozygous population. Each of those variants leads to a slightly different phenotype, right? For whatever that is. And then you've got 8 species that are going to be descended from that created kind. And each of them has to lose 7 of those variants and preserve one of them. But they all have to preserve a different one. So species number 1 keeps variant A, but loses B, C, D all the way down the line. Species number 2 keeps variant B, but loses A and C, D, E, F, so on. Species number 3 keeps variant C, and so on for each of those species. So he's saying that these processes, this loss of heterozygosity, has to happen in an extremely precise way in these different lineages in order for this speciation to work. You have to generate and then maintain that specific form of homozygosity that sets you apart from the other species in the family. The problem is the processes that do that, things like inbreeding and genetic drift, are not deterministic. You can't say which alleles are going to be maintained and which alleles are going to be lost within specific populations. These are not deterministic processes. He's saying natural selection doesn't play a role, so we can ignore natural selection as a mechanism that might say, oh, well, this pigment works better in this lineage and this one works better in this lineage, so those are the ones that end up being preserved in those lineages. You can ignore that. He says that's not operating. So how do you get this? How do you get this extremely precise apportionment of genetic variation? He doesn't explain it. He doesn't provide a mechanism. So speciation could be happening right now. Oh, it is. It is. There's lots of examples of speciation happening right now. I mentioned a few earlier. If you're willing to consider the biblically consistent, scientifically justified model, lot of credit he's given himself there. Okay, to underscore this fact, young Earth creationists are not evolutionists. Doth protest too much is what's going on right here. There's a term that I really like called creationist hyperspeciation or hyperevolution that describes how you get from the ark to all of the extant species. Faster speciation than evolution, is faster and broader speciation, I'll say, than is generally accepted in evolutionary biology. So instead, we postulate a very different source of genetic diversity. Yeah, yes, you do. this mechanism, he doesn't provide any support for this mechanism. That's the end of the chapter. There's no support for this mechanism. You would think, maybe you would say, here's an example of speciation. Look, we know this is the parent population, and here are two derived species from that parent population. And look, they have more homozygosity, and the parent population has more heterozygosity. Now, that would not demonstrate that that's the mechanism, but at the very least, you could show that it's consistent with what we see. He doesn't even attempt to do that. Doesn't even attempt it. Okay, so we're on page 55. We're going to 90. So like we're getting there, okay? We're getting there. Okay, evolutionists make the case for evolution. Okay, over the past few pages, I will be this. I love this because now we're in part 2. Actually, I should have skipped over this. Part 2, answering skeptics. So he's going to say, here are the counter arguments and here's why they're wrong. He's setting up part 2 of this book, most of the second half of this book, to say counter arguments and why they're wrong. Let's see how he does. So the first thing he does here is let's make the case for evolution. He essentially says, I'm going to steelman evolution. I'm going to make the best argument possible. And he really, he gives himself a lot of credit here. I will be doing my best to make the case for evolution from what evolutionists themselves have said. As you read, I'd like you to evaluate the case I make for evolution. Do you think I missed any points? Have I covered the main arguments? What do you think of the fact that a creationist has articulated this case and is familiar with the arguments? So before we do this, I'm going to take just a minute here and tell you what I would expect, having read that paragraph. What I would expect to hear if someone says, I'm going to make the best case for evolution, and I'm going to interpret that as universal common descent from a common, cellular, most recent common ancestor for all cellular life, so universal common descent from a most recent common ancestor for all cellular life via evolutionary processes. That's what I'm thinking as evolution, as we're defining it here. What do I think I should read in the subsequent pages? Well, the first thing is I should read about genetics. I should be reading about how sequence similarity among sequence-constrained and unconstrained sequences in the genome, that is, regions of the genome where the sequence doesn't matter, how they form nested hierarchies at every level of organization, right? You can look at primates, you look at mammals, you can look at chordates, vertebrates, you can look at animals, you can look at eukaryotes, you can look at all cellular life. You can build nested hierarchies from different parts of the genome. That's number one. That's the big thing. Number 2, we can observe these processes. The process that we say, that evolutionists say, get you from a prokaryotic most recent common ancestor for all cellular life to extant things. We can observe those processes happening in the world right now. Things like endosymbiosis. We could observe in the lab things going from unicellular to multicellular. Right? We can observe these things happening. 3, we all share common features that we don't have to share. We don't have to share them, but we do. There's only one kind of mitochondria, and we know what type of bacteria it is derived from. There's only one kind of mitochondria. There's one kind of chloroplast that almost every photosynthetic thing shares as its photosynthetic organelle. It's one kind. There's one group that's maybe getting a second new one, and it's super cool, but we don't worry about that one. Everyone that has ribosomes uses them the same way, right? All ribosomes are basically the same across all cellular life. We all use double-stranded DNA. Why do we do that? Why do we use double-stranded DNA? Viruses use double-stranded DNA, single-stranded DNA, double-stranded RNA, positive sense single-stranded RNA, negative sense single-stranded RNA. They're retrotranscribing. The reason that viruses do that is because they don't all share a common ancestor. Viruses are what's called polyphyletic. They have multiple independent origins. If cellular life was the same, we would expect to see that level of variation. We don't. The fact that there's one genetic code, there's variations on it in different specific groups, but there's one genetic code for life on Earth. That points to a most recent common ancestor for the genetic system that all life on Earth uses. Okay, so those are the kinds of things I expect to hear. You might also get things like fossils and concordance between fossil and genetic evidence in terms of like the timing for different events in the history. All good. That's kind of what I expect to hear. So genetic evidence, observed processes, and then concordance among different lines of evidence, right? Genetic, fossil, whatever, right? Those are the things that I expect to hear when someone says, I'm going to make the best case possible for evolution. So anybody have a prediction in terms of how Dr. Jeanson makes this case? Does he make what an evolutionary biologist thinks is a strong case for evolution? No. No, he doesn't. Let's see what he does. So, okay. In terms of specific evidence, any of Darwin's original arguments persist. That's not true. Darwin used a lot of biogeography, which is strong evidence for evolution. He used an analogy with artificial selection. Also true. That's legit. But that's not like, no one's going to use those things as like the best evidence for evolution these days. Okay. In the realm of paleontology, evolutionary arguments have gone modest updates. That's BS. We've gotten way more fossils. Way more. Very famously, Darwin said we don't have enough fossils to really support what I'm doing right now. Now we do. Like, for example, just look at like hominids. Look at all the different groups of, members of the Australopiths or genus Homo that are extinct. And we see there's disagreement over who belongs in which genus and exactly what the species delineations are. None of that stuff matters. What matters in terms of the validity of the concept is that what we see over time is a continuum of change from more ancestral traits to more derived traits, right? You see a transition from a quadrupedal posture to an upright posture. You see larger brains relative to body size, smaller jaws. You see differences in body proportions, right? Longer legs and shorter arms over time. Changes to the orientation of the joints in the hips, for example, for upright posture. Changes to the structure of the feet, right? You go from grasping to weight bearing for our feet. They're not good at bearing weight, but they're adapted for that rather than grasping when you're like climbing trees. So we see a series of traits that go from more ancestral to more derived. And in this case, more derived means more modern human-like. None of that evidence existed when Darwin was writing. Just didn't. So like, this is silly. And I don't even know a lot about the paleontology, and I know that this is silly. Here's something that you should always be skeptical of when you read anything by creationists. If they're quoting something and they leave something out, you should check what that is. Now, did I do that? No, I didn't check it because I don't care that much. I just want to point out for the audience that anytime you see this, check what's missing, because it not infrequently changes the meaning of what is being written here. So I just want to point that out. But it doesn't matter what this is, but I just want to point that out for you. Let's see what we've got here. Talking about Jerry Coyne and why evolution is true. Oh, by the way, he's done giving evidence, by the way. He's done giving evidence. He's just talking about like consensus now. He's just saying, big name scientists say that it's well supported. Yeah. So what about the unconvinced? Okay, let's see. I don't care about Richard Dawkins. Evolution is a fact. Okay, yes, I was right. Religious liars. Yeah, same people lying. People do lie. Jeanson lies. He's lied about stuff. This is not evidence in here. This is like getting mad. This is like personal grudges. Like he's getting mad at Biologos. Hates Biologos. So he gets mad at Dennis Venema. I've never actually pronounced his name. I think it's Venema, but anyway, he gets mad at him in here. None of this is like actual evidence for evolution. The most important argument. What's the most important argument? Let's see. Yeah. Oh, this is where he starts kind of modeling an exchange, and it's not good. We're not going to go through all of it. It doesn't matter. He then releases the book, and it felt like this is like Chick tracks level, like dumb. So we're not going to go through it, but it's like an evolutionist does this and a creationist does that. And this is silly, just like straw manning. This is not accurate. So he started this section by saying he's going to straw man, and he saying he's going to steel man, and he ends up just straw manning. The last why it remains the most important argument for evolutionists. Oh, what is it? Accomplish the maneuver. Oh, saying that creationism is pseudoscience. That's the most important argument for evolutionists all over the world. That's what he's saying, that the last resort is that creationism isn't actually science, and that's the best argument. that we have. That's BS. That's not the best argument. I'll make the case for evolution without mentioning creationism. I can make a scientific case against creationism. I said at the top, there are testable claims of creationism. And to the extent they have been tested, these hypotheses have been shown to be false. Like, that's it. It's testable. I don't have to invoke it's not science. I can point to things in creationism that are testable hypotheses, but they're wrong. So that was the big Steelman chapter, and it was all just terrible. All right, so let's look. We're now in chapter 13. Okay, I intend to show you that creation science has matured, that the major arguments for evolution have been turned on their head. Okay. Now he goes all-time great quote mine. Charles Darwin, 1859. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, could not be formed, numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would break down. But I can find no such case. At least he included that I can find no such case, because most creationists omit that when they use this quote mine. Jeanson here actually named Rex Behe. He actually mentions Behe in here at some point. I don't know where, but he's making an irreducible complexity argument, saying that like this is a thing. The example he uses is, again, this is one of the places where my jaw hit the floor, because he actually says, for example, how could numerous successive slight modifications lead to male and female? Are we serious? Are we serious? Is that really the question? We know the answer to that. We have lots of examples. Like, we know how this happens. I've had conversations with people about how sexual reproduction evolves. It's not hard. You start with mechanisms of recombination. You have specialization, cells that can do the recombination. They're gametes, and they go into a zygote, they fuse, and then in generating more gametes, you do recombination. Once you have that process in place, which is trivially easy to do because recombination exists in literally every form of cellular life does recombination, and viruses, so non-cellular life, also do recombination through various mechanisms. Once you have recombination tied to reproduction, that's called sexual reproduction. That's what that is. It's just when you take reproduction and recombination, you do them at the same time. They don't have to be together, but they can be. When you do that, that's called sexual reproduction. You don't need male and female to have that. You don't even need gametes. You just need two things that mix their genes together. And when you do that, you sometimes see the evolution of specific cells that are adapted to do the mixing. Those are called gametes. You're always going to have variation in the size of gametes in a population. Some gametes are bigger, some gametes are smaller. Like, some people are taller, some people are short, right? You have variation in size of gametes. Once you do that, once you have that variation, you are off to the races, because you are going to have what's called disruptive selection, where the extremes of a distribution are good and the middle is suboptimal. So you end up having big gametes get selected for, lots of very small gametes, right? You can make very few very big gametes, eggs, a lot of very small gametes, sperm, but in the middle, it's a suboptimal strategy. So you end up with egg and sperm, male and female. Once you have differentiated gametes, that's male and female. A lot of creationists, when they say, how did male and female evolve, they mean anatomically, right? How do you evolve the parts that have to fit together? How does the first male wait around for, the first female, right? How does that work, right? That's not what sexual reproduction is, right? That's later. Male and female is just differentiated gametes, and that is not hard to explain. The fact that Jeanson is using this as an argument, and again, developmental biologists should know better. Okay, so this is very generous. Mr. Wilford, for $20, this was the line that broke me straight up. Ray Comfort, yeah. It's not good, and I just want to just so everyone knows, if you missed at the top, Mr. Wilford actually gifted me this book. He bought this for me, so this is his fault. And the headache I received from banging my head on the desk repeatedly as I was reading it is also his fault. So thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate your contribution. You're very generous. Thank you. I can't believe he used it. This is amateur. This is amateur hour. This is really bad. This is really bad. Okay. Yeah. So he talks about Behe, Darwin's black box, irreducible complexity. I've shown why that's not a valid hypothesis. I've shown that that's false. It's not true. It's easy to falsify. It's trivially easy to falsify. It's just wrong. Okay. So he's saying, so that's Jeanson argument number one, irreducible complexity. Let's keep going. Ambiguous. Oh, so what he's going to do in this chapter called ambiguous is that there's evidence that doesn't allow you to distinguish. He's saying, oh, it could be evolution, could be creationism. It's ambiguous. That's the argument here. So let's say that I just love the hypotheticals. It really is like chick track level terrible. If you don't know what that is, Google it. It's terrible. Okay, so what did I highlight in this chapter? This is basically just a lot of equivocation. Oh, but then it gets to this part. Modern creationists argue that modern evolution have failed to continue what Darwin started, or have not fully applied the scientific method to modern creationist ideas. Like, y'all, that's what I do here. That's what I do. What I do on this channel is I apply the scientific method to modern creationist ideas. I take their hypotheses, I interpret them in the most generous way possible, and I say, can we validate this hypothesis? Or can we falsify this hypothesis? Like, this is literally what I do on my channel, Creation Myths. Why doesn't this happen in scientific journals? Because creationists don't even try to publish in scientific journals. Jeanson doesn't even try. He wants scientists to evaluate his ideas. Do the work. Submit to a journal. Go through peer review. I promise your ideas will be evaluated. I'll do it. It should be anonymous. I shouldn't be the one to do it. But, like, if you do the work, people will evaluate your ideas. Now, he's going to make an argument here that is, again, astonishing. And I'm just going to show you the figure because this is basically you can design things and get nested hierarchies. Therefore, how can we say nested hierarchies are evidence for evolution? That's the argument here. So he uses like vehicles. Never mind that it's very difficult to imagine how a nested hierarchy that's like where hang gliders represent kind of an ancestral state or a broad state, and then the more specific states like this figure doesn't make sense just in terms of like what's going. I'm going to zoom out. Let's see. We'll just do one zoom out so you can see the whole figure. Okay. Now, I don't think this figure makes sense just because of what organisms he uses here to represent things. But let's just start with the first problem. Things that humans design don't reproduce. Cars and tractors and tanks and aircraft don't reproduce. You need to reproduce as a prerequisite for evolutionary processes. So this is just silly. This is an extremely superficial amateur hour argument. Like, yes, there are things that are designed that superficially form nested hierarchies. Okay, that's irrelevant for evolution because the things that you designed don't reproduce. They don't have heritability. They don't have kids. Evolutionary processes don't affect them. I don't have any more to say about this figure. It's just like the fact that somebody who claims to want to be taken seriously is making this argument is astonishing to me. All right, we're almost done, everybody. I promise. Why wouldn't God accomplish similar, right, so he's talking about, you've got nested hierarchies, you've got intermediates. God could do it that way. Yes, God could do it that way. That's called special pleading. Thank you. That's called special pleading. Okay. Why did I highlight this whole page? What is wrong with me? What did I do here? I don't know, but we're going to find out. We've already seen the evolutionary evidence. You support common ancestry. Oh, so he's saying the evidence is ambiguous. It could go either way, right? Evidences cannot be used, right? So, but they failed to eliminate modern creationist hypothesis. So evolutionary evidence eliminates species being created, but it can't eliminate family level kind of stuff. What about the evidence for universal common ancestry, family tree for all life, all kinds? None of the hypotheses disprove the modern creationist explanation. Instead, the evidence is perfectly compatible. I've actually shown that that's not the case. I have shown that that's not the case in a creation myth called Created Design, I think is what I called it. I can link it down below if I remember to link all these things. But basically, the prediction would be that if you have separate creation events, if you have your orchard of life, for example, then the functional sequences in the genome should stay the same, right? They should all look the same because the same designer, right? Using the same wheels, using the same parts, whatever, fine. Those functional parts could form a nested hierarchy for everything. But the non-constrained parts of the genome, the parts where the sequence doesn't matter, those parts should vary in an uncorrelated way between the different kinds. Right? Because they start, you have a created state, and then you have things like mutation and genetic drift that are random, they're probabilistic, they're not deterministic, that are going to affect those unconstrained sequences within those different created groups. They should be uncorrelated with each other. But you can compare sequences that are unconstrained across kinds, and what you get is nested hierarchies. You get the same pattern, which means you're falsifying a direct prediction of the creation model. There's actually been papers on that looking at things like codon bias, the wobble sites where you can have variation in the actual exon sequence, the protein coding sequence, and still get the same amino acid sequence. And looking at those bases that are variable, you could actually derive the nested hierarchical pattern from those, even though according to creationists, you shouldn't be able to do that. So he's actually just wrong here. None of these hypotheses disprove the model. Like, that's not true. We can just directly falsify a prediction of that model. I've also tested Jeanson's predictions when it comes to mitochondrial mutation rates and shown that his rate is wrong when put up against real evidence. So we can directly test and falsify the creation model. He's just ignoring the things that you can do and that have been done in that regard. Okay. By the way, my aim for this was half an hour and I'm coming up on 80 minutes. So I blew that one, but oh well. Had a lot to say about Jeanson. Okay. He wraps this up by saying that every major argument for evolution doesn't disprove. None of them disprove the modern creationist view. And again, that's just not true. And I've given you a couple examples right here. And I've made videos on them. Okay. The modern advance of creation science has reset the origins debate. No, it hasn't. No, it hasn't. It hasn't done that at all. In fact, his book didn't make much of a splash. And I think some of this is just being mad about that, frankly. Okay. Unqualified. Now, is this the last chapter or is there one more? Let's see. I think it was maybe one more or, oh, there's two more. Okay. And then the summary and conclusion. We're almost done, everybody. 2 more chapters. It's not that many pages. Let's go back to unqualified. Okay. So if you found the preceding chapter persuasive, no. You might wonder what else we could have to, yeah, we got a lot left to discuss, Nathaniel. I got a lot of questions. All right. I got a lot of questions. So let's keep going. I lay out a third explanation for why the consensus reject. Oh, I love this. He says that the consensus is not qualified to adjudicate the debate. I love this argument. This one is super fun. I want to read this because he's so close. He's so close. So let's read these paragraphs together. Let's imagine a scenario where a group of PhD scientists has been born and raised in a windowless underground laboratory. They eat, sleep, work, and never leave the building. One day, you decide to visit. Curious, you ask them how the planet is illuminated. Oh, it's easy. Fluorescent and LED lights. Puzzled, you press them further. Don't you know that the sun illuminates Earth? Oh no, no one here agrees with that. In fact, the overwhelming majority of the scientists in this room knows the world is illuminated by light bulbs. The evidence is just overwhelming. Just look above you. Have you ever stepped outside this room to test the hypothesis that perhaps the sun illuminates the globe, you ask? This silly little story has many parallels to the modern scientific enterprise. In short, the vast majority of scientists who also happen to accept evolution has been trained in a bubble. From kindergarten to graduate school, the legal system in the United States forbids the teaching of creation science in public school classrooms. Effectively, there's a little quibble, little thing called the First Amendment, just a little roadblock to teaching religious stuff in a science classroom. A little thing called the Establishment Clause. So yeah, that's not allowed. Effectively, this means the professional scientists, those who are part of the AAAS, spend their entire careers never being required to read a single technical creationist paper. Almost none of these things, technical creationist papers, exist because creationists don't even attempt to do peer review. There's like a handful in the last decade that you can point to. And I like talking about those papers. I've talked about a number of them. They are never taught the modern creationist view. They are instructed the creationist hypothesis that compete with evolution. Let's just the self-aware wolves thing going on here, right? Like he's this close to getting it. He's this close and just misses it entirely, right? This close. But I just do want to point out here, they're never taught the modern creationist view. They're not instructed on creationist hypotheses. The reason for that is that in order to be taught something in school, whether it's elementary school, primary education, K-12, college, undergrad, graduate school, whatever, in order for something to be taught, it has to be reasonably well established. You don't get into the theoretical stuff until graduate school. Creationists have to make their case to the scientific community first. And then, having convinced the scientific community of the validity of their ideas, they'll be able to make their case to students. But students are the last people that find out about new ideas. New ideas first have to be won in the scientific community. And you have to do the work of convincing scientists that you are correct in the field that you are trying to dispute, right? So it's Jeanson's job first to convince me that he is correct. Once he convinces evolution as a field that his ideas are worth considering, not even correct, just worth discussing, not silly enough that undergraduates could show why he's wrong. Once he crosses that threshold of seriousness, then we might consider including them in classes to students. But until then, it's not going to happen. He's got the process backwards. You have to convince the scientists first, students last. It's ridiculous. Okay. So that's a nice little conspiracy theory thing going on there. Okay. So now he gets into the airing of the grievances. This is kind of a fun part at the end of his book where he talks about people talking about his work. So he talks about a debate he had with Dr. Herman Mayes. He has this line in here, which is really interesting. I was eager to have public peer review of my book by hostile parties. That's not what peer review means. Peer review is a specific process through which you submit your work for publication, and the editor of the outlet that you have submitted it to sends it to experts in the field you are writing about, and they anonymously evaluate it and send the editor their evaluations and recommendations, and whether they accept the findings, accept your argument or not, what changes they would like to see in order to find your argument convincing or at least viable, right? That's what peer review is. What he's saying here is not peer. He's using the word peer review, but he's not describing the process of peer review. You don't do peer review through a public debate on the internet, right? YouTube debates are not how you do peer review. It's not how that works. And he knows that. He knows better. He's just misusing the phrase on purpose. He knows better. He didn't try to get peer review because he sent out the book after it was published. Peer review happens before publication, not after. Okay. So he didn't like, you should watch that debate, by the way. He just was kind of pissy the whole time. So let's talk about peer reviews. What did I say here? Many critics of creationists object to the publication records of creation scientists. Yeah, we do. I sure do, because they don't even try, but the vast majority don't even try to publish. They don't even try. A few do. To their credit, they'll have one or two papers here and there. Douglas Axe has a famous paper. Michael Behe has a famous paper, both of which could be construed as being creation friendly. There was a recent paper on the waiting time problem by Gunter Beckley and some co-authors. John Sanford even has a couple of papers that could be construed as friendly to creationism. I don't think these are very good papers, but there are creation scientists who are at least doing a little bit of getting their stuff out into the scientific literature. Jeanson's not talking about that. He's not even trying. He publishes at AIG and that's it. That's a blog. It's not a journal. It's not peer reviewed. It's not scientific. So what did I write here? I wrote, yeah, okay, I got sweary. Yeah, that's not the argument. The argument of why aren't you doing peer review is not why don't more people agree with you. Peer review is not about getting people to agree with you. It's about making the case that what you're saying is valid for consideration. Not that it is the new paradigm everyone has to accept, but you have to cross a baseline level of seriousness and a baseline level of robustness in your work in order to survive the peer review process. And Jeanson is not even trying this. He's strawmanning when people say you should go through peer review. You should put your work through this process to have experts in the thing you're writing about evaluate it prior to publication. You should do calculations, build a model, have numbers, let people check those numbers, see if they stand up. Right? That's what people are saying Jeanson should do. That's not what he does, and he's lying about what the argument is. It's not why don't more people agree with you, it's why aren't you putting in the effort to convince people they should take you seriously. That's what the argument is, and Jeanson right here is lying about it. I'm so mad at you. This book is insulting. This is offensively bad. I can't believe I'm doing this for 90 minutes. We're almost done, I swear. This is just a misrepresentation of ENCODE. The authors claim they found support for function 80% of our DNA. Those same authors revised it downward a couple years later. Group of evolution says the conclusion must be wrong. Why? Because it disagrees with evolution? No. That's not why they said this is strawman. People like Dan Grauer and other people who said that the ENCODE project got out over their skis with their conclusion that 80% of the genome is functional. This is just wrong. They didn't say that's wrong because it disagrees with evolution or it has implications for evolution. That's not the counter argument. The counter argument is that ENCODE's work was sloppy, and they threw in a bunch of obviously spurious biochemical activity under the banner of functional without robustly defining the term functional. They conflated it with biochemical activity. Those are two separate categories. Functional is a subset of biochemical activity. That's the objection to the ENCODE project, not that it disagrees with evolution. Okay? That's like, again, this is a lie. And whether Jeanson either he knows what the objections to the ENCODE finding are here, that 80% claim, either he knows what the objections are or he's lying, and he's lying about it, or he thinks that this is the case, in which case he's not even doing the bare minimum of looking up what the critics are saying before making a claim about what they say. He's just getting his information from second, third, fourth hand creationist sources. So this is where I get mad at Jeanson, because he's making claims that are just like bonkers. They're just false. He's just lying about stuff. All right. Final chapter, the gold standard. The gold standard refers to, making predictions is the gold standard of science. No, that's wrong. Making predictions that are shown to be accurate. Making predictions, test them, they turn out to be accurate. That's the gold standard of science. So he says creation science has met and exceeded. No, it hasn't. He says that this Finch confirmed a prediction. He talks about this math is insane. I'm not even going to go through this math because it is banana pants, but he's talking about like the rate at which speciation can occur. And I mentioned earlier that he just ignores all the ecological constraints. I'm not going to go through the math, but this is meaningless because he's ignoring ecological constraints in evolutionary processes. And you can't ignore things like that. So I'm just going to ignore that. It doesn't matter. But what he's saying is the new Finch species validated his prediction in terms of like bird speciation rates or whatever, right? The problem is that's 100% wrong, because the mechanism that he described up above, that loss of heterozygosity within the different groups, that's not the mechanism of this Finch. This Finch is a hybrid. So what happens when you have hybridization is you have a big spike in heterozygosity because you have two different lineages interbreeding. So they bring differences. So you get a lot of heterozygosity. And then that heterozygosity real fast collapses because you have a small population. If the hybrid is isolated from the two parent species, it's necessarily going to be a small population. So you have lots of genetic drift, and you get lots of inbreeding. So you have a big spike in heterozygosity, which then collapses. That's not the mechanism that Jeanson describes. It's a different mechanism. So you can't even use that as a validation of his prediction. It's not the mechanism that he describes. It's wrong. It's just wrong. So he ends here, and I love this. He ends here talking about what he describes as the only one rigorous attempt to engage in chapter 7 of his book. Chapter 7 is where he talks about things like the mitochondrial Eve mutation rates. And this is from a series of pieces by a blogger, a graduate student blogger, EvoGrad. It's the definitive written takedown of replacing Darwin. And if you're interested in replacing Darwin or Jeanson or any of this stuff, you should 100% read EvoGrad's work. It's phenomenal. You should read it. Now, EvoGrad put a lot of work into that. It's actually, his work is actually longer than Jeanson's book. And he went back and he actually did a lot of the work. Like he redid Jeanson's methods and showed that they're invalid, showing that if you do Jeanson's methods with his data sets, you don't get the conclusion that Jeanson claims. Like he does that and he shows his work and very clearly what happens. Now, Jeanson did not see fit to respond to any of the nuts and bolts of that work. This is what he says. This is what he says about EvoGrad's work right here. If you read his entire critique, you won't find a single prediction that future observations could reveal to be false. Because he's not making novel predictions. He's testing your predictions, Nathaniel. He's not making novel predictions. He's testing yours. That's the point of the exercise that EvoGrad is doing, right? He's saying, okay, we have this book. It's full of claims that, and the author claims it's very technical, right? So let's go through and evaluate those. Let's do the math. Let's see if they stand up. And he goes through chapter by chapter and shows that it doesn't hold up. Jeanson's beef is he doesn't make his own predictions. It's not what he's doing. He's reviewing your work, which, might I remind you, you wanted people to do. Let's just make sure. Hang on. Let's make sure. I was eager to have a public peer review of my book by hostile parties. That's what EvoGrad did. When you're doing a peer review, you don't make novel predictions. You're testing somebody else's predictions. You're evaluating their work, right? So Jeanson gets what he wants. I think he's a little pissy because it was a graduate student, not like, Richard Dawkins or something, right? But he got what he wanted. He got a critical peer review publicly. And this is his response. This is just throwing a tantrum is what this is. This is not a serious response to that work. So, summary and conclusion. We've let the evolutionists make their strongest case. No, you didn't. That was just straw manning. This is supposed to be an update to Replacing Darwin, but it's completely devoid of data, facts. It's just claims and assertions, descriptions of models without supporting information. Replacing Darwin has an extensive this is a friend of mine and a number of other people would know R.J. Downard would take offense with this statement. Replacing Darwin does not have an extensive bibliography. It has, I would term it a half-assed bibliography. The lit review that went into that book was insufficient, we'll say. I've shown that modern biology is abundantly consistent with the plain reading of the Bible, especially, no, you didn't. Your math is all wrong, and you didn't show any of the math here. And then he gets to the end here, and it's just, God, Jesus, yada, yada, right? And that's how he ends it. That's Replacing Darwin. The takeaway from going through it at full length, I can't believe that took so long. I'm sorry, everybody. I'm going to wrap this up real fast here. The takeaway from kind of the full-length review here is that this book is full of unsupported assertions and just amateur hour arguments that an adult who knows anything about biology should be just offended to make. And I don't know how Dr. Jeanson thinks that this is a serious work or expects to be taken seriously by the field of evolution, right? Evolutionary biology and evolutionary biologists. I don't know what he expects because this is just something else. And that's all I got. That's Replacing Darwin, Made Simple, by Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. It is a complete dumpster fire of unsupported assertions, bad science, bad analogies, and just blatant misstatements of facts, and I will say it, lies. That's what I got. That's Replacing Darwin by Nathaniel Jeanson. I can't believe it took almost 2 hours. Thank you for watching. I appreciate all of you. Have a great night, everybody.